I remember that afternoon with strange clarity, not because anything about it was supposed to be memorable, but because it began as one of those completely ordinary, exhausting days that blur together in your mind, the kind where you move through life on autopilot, focused only on small practical things like getting home, eating something quick, and resting your body after work. And at the time I pulled into that gas station, all I cared about was the fact that my fuel light had been on for nearly 20 miles. My head was heavy from a 10-hour shift at the warehouse. My shirt clung to my back from the late summer heat, and the only thought repeating quietly in my mind was that once I filled the tank and got a cold drink, I could finally go home, take off my boots, and sit in silence without anyone needing anything from me. The gas station itself was nothing special, just a small corner lot at a busy intersection with faded yellow lines on cracked concrete, 6 pumps arranged into rows, and a convenience store whose glass doors were covered in sun-bleached posters advertising energy, drinks, and lottery tickets, while the air smelled faintly of gasoline, warm asphalt, and the sugary scent of cheap coffee drifting from inside. And when I pulled into the lane, I noticed an SUV finishing up at the pump ahead of me. So I slowed to a stop, waited maybe 30 seconds, and then rolled forward as it drove away, lining my car up with the pump, turning off the engine, and stepping out into the thick heat that felt like it pressed down on your shoulders the moment you left the air-conditioned interior. At first, I barely noticed the white crossover SUV pulling up behind me, but after a few seconds, I heard the low rumble of its engine idling and saw it in my side mirror. The driver sitting very upright with both hands on the steering wheel as if she were still driving rather than waiting. And although I didn't think much about it at the time, I did notice the way her fingers tapped sharply against the wheel in quick, impatient movements that somehow carried an air of irritation even from a distance. The pump clicked slowly upward, $15, 20, 25, and my mind drifted into that dull, tired state where thoughts move slowly and without direction. But then a short, sharp honk cut through the background noise of traffic, making me glance back instinctively. And when I did, I saw the woman leaning slightly forward, her expression tight, her sunglasses reflecting the bright sunlight so I couldn't fully see her eyes. And at first I assumed maybe she had honked accidentally or was signaling someone else. So I turned back toward the pump without reacting. But then another honk came, longer this time, and when I looked again, she raised one hand in an exaggerated questioning gesture as if to say, well, which left me confused enough that I stepped slightly away from my car and called back, trying to keep my tone neutral, asking if she needed something, and she responded immediately in a sharp voice that carried clearly across the short distance between us, asking whether I was almost done, as though I had some obligation to update her about the progress of filling my own fuel tank. Honestly, that I had just started and it would take a few minutes, because my tank had been nearly empty, and I even gestured toward the other side of the station where at least the pumps were clearly open and available, but she didn't look in that direction at all, instead tightening her mouth and saying that she wanted this pump and that I had already been standing there for far too long, which struck me as both unfair and strangely absurd, because it had been no more than a couple of minutes since I arrived. I tried to end the interaction politely by saying it wouldn't be much longer, but she rolled her window up with a sharp motion and began honking intermittently every 30 seconds or so, each blast sounding more aggressive than the last, drawing curious glances from other customers at the station. And although I initially attempted to ignore her, focusing instead on the rising numbers on the pump display and reminding myself that arguing would only waste more time, the repeated honking gradually chipped away at my patience, especially since I was already exhausted from work and had no energy for unnecessary conflict. Eventually, after another long honk, I turned back again and said more firmly that I was simply pumping gas like anyone else. She could use. But instead of acknowledging the obvious solution, she suddenly opened her car door, stepped out, and walked toward me with quick, stiff steps, her heels clicking loudly against the concrete, her expression tight, with a kind of controlled anger that made it clear she believed herself to be completely justified. She stopped a few feet away, crossed her arms, and declared that I had been loitering at the pump and blocking it for an unreasonable amount of time, which was such a strange accusation that I actually laughed softly out of disbelief, because the idea of loitering while actively pumping gas seemed almost ridiculous. And I pointed toward the nozzle still in my tank, and said calmly that I was literally in the middle of fueling my car. Insisting that I was wasting time on purpose, and that people like me had no respect for others. But when I repeated again that she could simply use one of the other available pumps, she shook her head sharply and said in a flat, determined voice that she shouldn't have to move because she had arrived in that lane first, which wasn't even true, and before I could respond, she added something that caught me completely off guard. She said she was going to call the police. At first, I genuinely thought she was bluffing, because it seemed unreasonable for anyone to involve law enforcement over something so minor. But she immediately pulled out her phone, dialed, and began speaking loudly enough that I could hear every word, telling the dispatcher that there was a man refusing to move his car, blocking a pump, and causing a disturbance, which made me feel both frustrated and oddly stunned, as though I were watching an exaggerated scene from a television show, rather than standing in a real gas station lot after a long day of work. By the time my tank finished filling and the pump clicked off, I had decided not to leave immediately because I wanted to see how the situation would resolve, partly out of disbelief, and partly because I knew that driving away might allow her to twist the story further. So I replaced the nozzle, closed my gas cap, leaned against my car, and waited quietly while she continued pacing near her vehicle, speaking in sharp bursts into her phone. Within a few minutes, a patrol car pulled into the lot without sirens, and 2 officers stepped out calmly, scanning the area with the relaxed expressions of people who already suspected. This was not an urgent situation, and the woman rushed toward them immediately, gesturing animatedly in my direction while speaking rapidly, her tone full of indignation. As though she had been seriously wronged, the officers listened briefly before walking over to me, and when one of them asked what was going on, I explained in a straightforward way that I had simply been pumping gas. And she became angry because she thought it was taking long, and I even pointed toward the still available pumps across the lot, which seemed to confirm the situation instantly because the officer's expression shifted into one of mild understanding, mixed with a hint of restrained amusement. But I could see her posture gradually stiffen. Rush while pumping gas, especially when other pumps were open, and although she continued to argue briefly, gesturing in sharp motions, her voice eventually dropped and she returned to her SUV with visible frustration. She drove away without looking at me again, moving directly to one of the open pumps she could have used from the beginning, and when the officers returned, one of them apologized politely for the inconvenience, saying they often received calls over situations that seemed minor, but escalated because of impatience, which left me feeling both relieved and strangely drained, as though the entire encounter had pulled energy from an already exhausted body. After they left, I sat inside my car for a moment before starting the engine, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner and reflecting on how something as simple and routine as pumping gas could transform into a tense confrontation purely because one person believed their time and preferences mattered more than basic fairness and common sense. And as I finally drove away from the station, merging into the steady flow of evening traffic, I couldn't help thinking that the most unsettling part of the experience wasn't the argument itself, or even the police being called, but the realization of how quickly ordinary moments can become stressful when patience disappears and people forget that everyday spaces, like a small, cracked concrete gas station on a hot afternoon, are shared by everyone equally, each person carrying their own fatigue, worries, and quiet desires simply to finish what they need to do and go home in peace.